All right, we good? We good? Yeah, I think we're ready to go. Thank you everyone for coming to our session, Android Design for UI Developers. Today we're going to talk about how to implement some of those awesome patterns that we have documented on developer.android.com/design. My name is Roman Nurik. There we go. My name is Roman Nurik. I'm on the Android Developer Relations team.
And hi, my name is Nick Butcher, also on the Android Developer Relations team out of London. Roman and I on the DevRel team focus on UX and design, so we're here to help you guys to build some awesome applications. Some of you might know us from a weekly YouTube show we do called Android Design in Action, so every Tuesday on YouTube, where we talk about how to design awesome Android applications. So today's going to be slightly different. We're going to be focusing much more on the code, as this is a developer conference. We're going to tell you how to actually go about building those cool applications, not just design them.
Yeah, so we're going to cover three main themes today. The first is app navigation, where we'll talk about some of the newer patterns, as well as some of the existing navigation patterns that are out there. Then Nick will talk about.
Yeah, I'm going to tell you all about responsive design, what it is, why you should care, and how you could go about building it in your apps.
We'll say that if you focus on, or if you pay attention, if you guys are on your laptops and stuff, if you pay attention to a single section of this session, please listen to Nick. So whenever he talks, listen to him.
No pressure.
And then I'll finish off with a discussion of the Holo visual language, specifically how to implement some of the visual characteristics that are part of Holo, Android's new kind of Holo style and theme. So first, let's talk about app navigation, shall we? So anytime we talk about navigation, you think about a couple of different ways to navigate. So one of those important ways is lateral navigation. Basically, the way in which you switch between sibling elements, or like kind of members of a single collection, or top-level sections in the app. So the action bar, as probably many of you know, is one mechanism or one tool that gives you access to lateral navigation. So you can use things like tabs or a spinner in the action bar to provide kind of access to sibling sections. We're not going to talk about how to implement the action bar because I feel like that's been covered to death. But we have a really good training class on developer.android.com/training that talks about how to do this. It's called Implementing Effective Navigation. It has a section called Implementing Lateral Navigation. Please take a look. It's really awesome. We do want to talk about compatibility for the action bar. So as many of you know, the action bar is not available on versions of the platform below API 11. But we have been working on something called ActionBarCompat, which will give you access to the action bar on all versions 2.0 and above. So if you look at the native APIs on the left here, you see that you basically have like activity or fragment activity, get action bar. The APIs for ActionBarCompat will be very, very similar. So this overall structure of your code doesn't change. You basically just swap in some different imports, swap in some different names for certain classes and things, and you're done. So this is not available right now, I should mention. This is still something that we're working on. It's going to be available very soon. If you're using the I/O app right now, the Google I/O Android app right now, it's using this ActionBarCompat library, so you can take that as a hint that it is kind of coming sooner rather than later. Like I said, it will be available on Android 2.1 and above. You'll be able to use it on those versions, which is basically all devices out there. And a very important note here is that if you're already using ActionBar Sherlock, which is a phenomenal library by Jake Wharton, he's actually in the developer sandbox for Square. If you're using that library, you shouldn't feel the need to, oh my god, all of a sudden, switch over to this version of the compatibility library. It's a phenomenal, ActionBar Sherlock is a phenomenal library. It's going to be very similar in terms of APIs. And so ActionBarCompat, we'd recommend for new apps. If you're creating a new app, you should consider ActionBarCompat. You have basically, or you will have basically, two very, very good options for ActionBar compatibility. So basically this means if you're thinking about the action bar and not using it because of compatibility, you no longer have that excuse.
No excuses now. Just use it.
Exactly. So another important navigation component is ViewPager. So anytime we talk about lateral navigation, we also think about swiping left and right, or the swipe views pattern. Now, ViewPager is the kind of the canonical implementation of that pattern. And again, it's covered very well in our training classes, so we're not going to go into too much detail there. The reason I mention it here is that we should really be using it. If you're using any sort of horizontal paging, please use this kind of built-in canonical implementation. Your users will thank you for it.
Especially if you're using tabs like in your slide here. So whenever you see tabs, think swipe.
Exactly. We do want to cover a new pattern that was just kind of formalized yesterday in an update to the Android design guide called navigation drawers. So navigation drawers are primarily for main app navigation. So if you have several disparate sections in your app, a navigation drawer is another tool you now have for lateral navigation. Now, I'm not going to talk about all the different guidelines here. All the documentation is published on developer.android.com/design/patterns. If you click on the navigation drawer section, you'll see all that stuff. I will say that as many of you saw in the Google Play Music part of the keynote, the navigation drawer has a slightly different style than you'd expect. It doesn't slide the content out of the way. The action bar stays fixed. And not sliding the content out of the way is kind of one way to further indicate that this is really a piece of Chrome. It's a piece of Chrome, like the action bar, that sits atop of your content. So the content is really stable there. The other thing that this does is it helps preserve the horizontal gesture space. So if your content involves things like swiping to dismiss and things like that, it's still very compatible with this pattern.
So in contrast to what you're saying about the action bar and action bar Sherlock, if you are using some of the other community libraries out there, you might consider moving to this official library, because this implements all of our best practices and UX that we recommend you use. So really do consider that.
Exactly. So I want to show you a quick video of what this looks like. You start out with just your activity content. If you touch on the left in the bezel, it kind of peaks for a bit, and then you can expand out the drawer. You can interact with it, of course. And then you can also kind of swipe to hide it. You can also touch on the action bar's top left area to show and hide it as well. So there are a lot of kind of unique little things about this pattern, and we're going to talk about how to implement this pattern using some of the new features in the support library just released yesterday. So to implement a navigation drawer, the very first thing you do is in your activity content, you simply replace the top-level layout with a drawer layout. And that's available in the support library. It works on API 4 and above, which is basically every device out there. This drawer layout contains two children. It should contain two children. The first is the actual activity contents, so everything that you had in your activity before. And then the second child of the drawer layout should be the actual drawer that slides out. And that's usually going to be something like a list view or a grid view or something, generally a list view. Now, you can set the width of this to fix that width to whatever you want. We recommend somewhere between 240 dip and 320 dip of width. And you can vary that, of course, by device if you find that on larger screen devices you want a slightly larger drawer. Now, that gets you, just doing that gets you all the edge swipe stuff. It does a lot of the things for you. But another important part of the drawer is how it interacts with the action bar. So for that, we have another component that's part of the support library, R13, called ActionBarDrawerToggle. And that's basically kind of a helper method, or a helper class, that ties the action bar with the drawer. So you simply create a new, you instantiate the ActionBarDrawerToggle. You give it the activity, you give it the drawer layout itself, you give it the icon to show in the top left, because that icon is custom for navigation drawers. And then you basically set this ActionBarDrawerToggle instance as the drawer listener for the drawer layout. Now, one quick note about the icon. It's available for download. We have both Holo Light and Holo Dark variations in all the different densities available for download. But you should customize this, right? So if you are theming your action bar, slightly kind of changing the colors and such, make sure that you customize this to fit in with the theme. One other important, actually I guess a very important part of the ActionBarDrawerToggle is that you need to pass through the onOptionsItemSelected method from your activity. And this takes care of actually handling button presses on the action bar's top left area. Basically, it just handles the Android.R.ID.Home click. And that's basically it for navigation drawers. That's really all the main code that you need. It's really easy to do. You guys should absolutely start using it if it makes sense for your app. And again, this is all available in the support library R13, which was pushed yesterday. So one last note, I guess, on navigation is up navigation. So we had a full talk dedicated to up and back navigation last year from Adam Powell and Rich Fulcher. But this year, we wanted to kind of give you some extra tips and tricks on implementing up, since some folks still implement it the wrong way. So the first thing to do to implement up is you have to tell the action bar to show the up button, and you can do that using this method here. Now, Jelly Bean, as of Android 4.1, you can automatically, or the system will automatically handle up presses for you. You simply give a parent activity name for each of your activities, and the system will take care of taking you to the right place when you press up. For earlier versions of the platform, you can use this metadata element to supply that same value. Now, it's worth noting that in a lot of cases, you have to customize where you go when the user presses up. And rather than handling all the up stuff yourself, simply override these two methods. You override the getParentActivity intent method to tell the platform which activity to visit when you press up. And you can also customize what happens by providing extras that you would then handle in that activity. And then you can also override the onCreateNavigateUp task stack method to basically customize what happens when you're navigating up outside of your core task. So this happens, for example, if you get to your app from something like Gmail, pressing up should stay within your app. This lets you customize what happens there. You'll see that it still mirrors the overall structure of your app, how you got to that activity. So I think that's it for navigation. I'm going to go off and hand things to Nick to talk about responsive design.
Cheers, Roman. So part of the joy and strength of Android is the variety of devices out there. You can choose from small phones, big phones, tablets, and everything in between. But as developers, that can perhaps seem daunting to make sure your UI is going to look great on each of those different size devices. So luckily, Android has been built from the very beginning to deal with this kind of different size devices. So it has lots of great tricks in there which you can use, things like relative layouts and layout weights and so forth, which will help you to build a scalable UI. And I hope that you're using all these things already. The problem with this is that scaling your UI up and down is only going to get you so far. So I'm going to go through and outline some of the issues you might run into if you're just relying on these kind of scaling techniques and how you can better work around them. So one of the challenges you might encounter if you're scaling is something like this, where you have an excessively wide layout. So here we're running text and images to the entire width of the device, and it leads to kind of quite an uncomfortable reading experience. It's quite hard to scan. Ideally, you want to be aiming for like a line length of about 45 to 75 characters, and anything longer is going to feel very uncomfortable and not very easy to use. We don't have great tooling at the moment for automatically detecting these line lengths, but you can use the multi-config editor that we showed in the keynote and in the new developer studio, which will help you to kind of get an idea and visually inspect what your layout's going to look like on a variety of different devices. One hint that you might look for that you're going to run into this kind of issue is whenever you find yourself typing this into the editor, like layout width equals match parent, you want to stop and think, how is this going to scale up to larger devices? Is this going to lead to this kind of excessively long line length issue? Another challenge you might run into is something like this, where you end up with a very unbalanced kind of UI. So here in this example application, we can see all of the content is kind of like clustered together tightly into the top left-hand corner, leaving huge swathes of space around. You can often encounter this behavior if you're just using like a list kind of driven application, which kind of left align all of the content, and you end up with this like huge amounts of white space on the other side on larger devices. What you really want to ideally go for is a more balanced look. You want to be able to kind of step back and squint at your application and have an overall balanced distribution of your content. And the last challenge I wanted to call out is one really of like a missed opportunity, really. So when your app is running on a larger device, you really want to take advantage of the fact that you have this extra room, this extra space. You want to put your content first and let your content really enjoy it. So here's an example of an application which is perhaps showing a lot of imagery. And here the images thumbnails have come out very small, and you can't really see them very well. So it's such a shame that you're not actually reacting to the amount of space available on a device and showing them off. So those are some of the challenges you might get into with scaling kind of approaches. So here are some techniques you can use to counteract it. The first kind of strategy I want to talk about is combination. So this is simply where you, when you have more space available to you on a device, you combine different content. So this is an example of what we call the master detail flow. So on a phone or a smaller device, you'll have two layouts which you combine together when you have sufficient room. Building this kind of layout is much easier if you're already embracing fragments. So fragments have been, again, pretty well covered. I'm not going to kind of take you through them, but essentially they're building blocks which you can reduce your app down to. So it makes it easier to define these individual blocks and then just lay them out differently. So you don't only have to code them once and then just move them around. So to build this kind of like master detail, you can use this trick we call like alternate layouts. So in the smaller device example, we define two separate activities. And each of those activities includes a single fragment filling up the whole screen. On larger devices, we override that same activity with a different definition and include both fragments at once. So here you can see I'm using the layout-W600DP resource qualifier, which means that devices with have at least 600 dips of width available to them will pick up this configuration instead and go for the combined view. Even easier than writing all that is using this template, which is included in your IDE. So here you can generate this code to create a master detail flow. So just walk through the wizard, give it your objects, and it will generate the activities, the fragments, the glue code to make them talk to each other, the styles. So it's getting much easier for you to create this kind of layout.
It's worth noting, I guess, that this isn't currently available in Android Studio, or maybe it is. Tor would probably be able to tell. Mm-hmm. It's not yet available, but it is something that we are going to work on to get it in there, because this is an important tool.
Okay. Cheers. And another tool for building these kind of combination approaches is another custom layout that has just launched in R13 of the support library, so it just went out yesterday. And that is the sliding pane layout. So the sliding pane layout lets you build these kind of two-column views where you say, this is like my master and this is my detail pane. And if there's enough room, it'll lay them out next to each other. But if there isn't, like on the case on the right, it'll actually overlap them so one's on top of each other. Sliding your finger across, will reveal the master pane again. And you can either select an item or slide back to go back to the kind of like overlapping view. It's worth calling out the differences, like how this is different to the drawer layout, which Roman talked about earlier on. These two panes really are kind of like in the same plane. So unlike the navigation drawer where the Chrome kind of comes across the top, these are both kind of content panes. So they're in the same kind of space, and they move together, so you can think of them being like very tightly connected. They're not like disparate navigation targets. They're very, very connected to two contents. Yeah, so I'd kind of summarize it to say that drawer layout is really for primary app navigation. It's really kind of Chrome versus content, and this is all about content. This is effectively a tool to take master detail flows and simplify them across different orientations and tablets. Awesome. So to implement this sliding pane layout, it's very similar to the navigation drawer. You define it as your root layout, and you give it two children. The first child is going to form that master or left-hand pane, and the second child is going to be the content pane. So you define a layout width for each of those. And so if the sum of those two widths exceeds the amount of space available upon the device, then they're going to overlap, and you have this sliding behavior. If the device has enough room, it's going to show them side by side. You can also set a layout weight of 1 on the content pane, which means that it will expand to fill the extra space like when it's shown on its own. So you can really think of the layout weight on the content pane as the minimum size at which it's going to lay out. So this is a really easy way you can build this kind of like responsive layout. So that was it for combination type strategies. The next strategy I want to go on to is what we call macro reflow. So the idea of this reflow is to rearrange the major blocks of your content. So here's an example. We can see that when a device is like on a larger device or in landscape, we're going to reflow it down, rearrange the kind of content blocks to avoid those problems of having like really excessive line lengths or having unbalanced content. So this can be really simply achieved using the alternate layout approach again. Here you can see by using fragments, we're just defining the content once, and then very simply just using a different layout, which just specifies an alternative orientation. So when it's in landscape, they'll be stacked next to each other, and when it's in portrait, they'll be on top of each other. Really simple, but makes a huge difference. And so the next strategy I want to go on to is what we're calling like micro reflow. So rather than taking these major blocks and moving them around, it's actually going to look at the individual blocks, and they're going to change their representation depending on how much space they have to lay out. So this kind of micro reflow makes huge use of what we call like dimension files. So hopefully a lot of you are using these already, but I really want to stress it in case anyone out there isn't. So just like in your layouts, I hope none of you are hard-coding strings like directly into your layouts. I'd say the same is true for like your kind of like layout configurations and your sizes and dimensions and so forth. You really want to be putting all of those things into like a dimensions file or a style for two reasons. Firstly, it lets you like reuse these same dimensions across different screens throughout your app, so you can have consistent margins and consistent text sizes throughout your application. And secondly, it lets you like kind of override them and provide alternative sizes and dimensions on different devices. So here's an example where I've defined these standard dimensions for text sizes and margins and line spacing, for example, and defined them in this dimensions file and use them throughout the application, different screens. And then on a larger device, I can provide different sizes. So it's really simple to use the same layout, but just bump up the text sizes or the margin sizes or line spacing to get a better experience on a larger device.
I think that this actually helps kind of recompose your screens on larger devices to rebalance. Kind of when you step away and you squint and you look at the screen, you kind of see everything smushed to the top left. This type of approach will really help kind of rebalance things. So it's very, very important to use this technique, especially for tablet UIs.
Yeah, and one point I especially want to call out here is in this example, I'm using the SW, or the smallest width qualifier. So what this does is it looks at the smallest width of the device, which is going to be the width in portrait, and it just uses that. So it's an orientation agnostic qualifier. The reason I've chosen to use this here is some of these dimensions, you don't want them altering just because you've rotated the device. It can be quite jarring, like if you're just reading some text and you rotate your device, it's going to relay out again for the different size, but if it also changed text size, it can be add to that kind of confusion. So using something like a SW, or this orientation agnostic qualifier, you can keep some of these dimensions stable while some dimensions will change. So some examples of doing this kind of micro reflow is kind of margin point, I like to say. Sometimes you just can't use combination or reflow to kind of move around or get more content onto screen, but you still want to avoid these unbalanced or excessively long line lengths. So instead, you can simply introduce page margins. So a technique for doing this is setting a style onto your content container. Here I've called it margin point, and we're going to use that style to provide the layout width of the content container. So on a smaller device, the style is going to say, hey, just match the parent here, so it's going to grow, up until you reach a maximum size you want your content to reach. Here I've chosen 600 dips. So when it reaches that size, it's going to kind of clamp and never continue to grow any larger. And here, by setting a layout gravity of center, it's going to kind of put the content in the center and have these like margin points, so you don't get this excessively wide or unbalanced feel to your application.
I guess I wanted to make 2 quick points here. So you notice the W600 dip modifier, or qualifier, if you will. So it's important to note that that is the width of the screen and not the width of the content. So if your content has like extra padding or margins or such, make sure to account for that when you're doing the math to determine this switching point. Another point I wanted to make really quickly is that this may not work for every scenario. It's perfectly okay in some cases to use dialogues on tablets and full screen activities on phones, phone-sized UIs. And so a way you can do that is to use the theme.holo.dialog when large theme. And you can also customize that, basically using a very similar resource qualifier-based approach.
Thanks. And so the last point I want to give you, or tip I want to give you on doing this kind of micro reflow approach, is switching from lists to grids. So as I mentioned before, list views can sometimes feel unbalanced when they grow to larger devices. So it's going to be great to kind of switch over to a kind of grid representation if you have content that works for it. So say something which has like a consistent height or has like a very visual kind of graphic which you can include. This can work really, really well. So to build this kind of approach, instead of using a list view, you simply use a grid view in your layout. And then for the attribute, the number of columns attribute, you reference an integer resource. So you can then define the number of columns it's going to use based on the size of the device. So by default, you can go into single column mode, which is going to give you the list view type representation. But then on larger devices, you can step up to 2 or more columns. You'll simply need to respect that change in your, respect that change in your adapter. So in your adapter, you can query that very same integer resource, find out how many columns the grid view wants to use, and then inflate a different layout for the individual items. So it can either be like a list style item if it's in single column, or like a grid style layout if it's in multiple column view.
I guess it's worth pointing out that grid view and list view are very similar in terms of API. They both inherit, they both subclass the apps list view class. So switching between list view and grid view on different cases that's also possible as well. So definitely feel free to do that in your apps.
Cool. So those were some of the challenges you might encounter with like a scalable approach and how responsive design can help you to kind of get around them. One point I wanted to make is that in all of those kind of strategies we just talked through, never once did we talk about kind of like a phone layout and a tablet layout. Each of them was based upon the content. It took a content-first approach, where you said that, hey, this is my content, and it knows how it can go into a single column mode or a two column mode, and I define a switching point at which I change that behavior. So by defining your content on these switching points, instead of thinking in like strict device terms, you kind of future-proof yourself a little bit. Who knows what other size and shape and orientation, aspect ratio devices are going to come around the corner, and you want your application to be able to cope with them. By putting your content first and thinking about your content to size it, and whatever device comes along, we'll just pick the most appropriate one that's going to work for it. So now I'm going to hand it back to Roman to give you some pro tips on implementing the Holo visual language.
Yeah, so Holo visual language. I mean, that means a couple of different things. Just for some really quick exposition, or I guess background, back in, I guess, Android 3.0 Honeycomb, we redesigned or rethought the UI for Android, and that kind of manifested in this Holo visual language. And there are two major tenets that I can think of right now about the Holo visual language that are important to note as we go through the process of implementing it. The first is a refocus, or I guess a focus, on content versus Chrome. So we want to spend as many of the pixels we have available to us on content rather than showing boxes and borders and things like the Chrome. It's kind of like it's kind of like a refocus on showing the information rather than the machinery behind it that makes everything work. Now the second tenet, I guess it's kind of a subtenet of the first one, is really a focus on space and typography to communicate hierarchy rather than things like borders and boxes and so on. So as we go through this process, keep that in mind. Because that's kind of what influences some of these decisions. So the very first thing you need to do to implement Holo, use the Holo visual language in your app, is to inherit the theme.holo theme or one of its descendants. So one thing to note is that this is only available on API 11 and higher, Android 3.0 and higher. And so one thing you can do to mitigate that is to have this kind of switching behavior for the base theme. You can inherit theme.holo.light, for example, on API 11 and higher, and then just theme.light, which is available everywhere in earlier versions of the platform.
This trick of actually having a base, like a level of indirection between, so inheriting from the base theme, which it has like, a different switching point, is really handy because some of the platform behaviors which you want to take advantage of were introduced at different levels of the API, and using this base behavior, you can like switch on that and insert it into your hierarchy. It's really handy. Yeah, we use this a lot in the I/O app, which will be open sourced at some point very soon, so you can see how we make use of this. I do want to mention that when we release the ActionBarCompat library, it'll handle a lot of this stuff for you for your activities theme or your applications theme. Simply, you'd inherit theme.appcompat.light. That file name may change, but rather than having to switch on this stuff, you can just inherit from this. This is, again, coming soon. So once you've inherited the theme.holo theme, I should really figure out a better way to say that. Once you've inherited that theme, it's time to use some of the resources that the framework gives you for free. And one of the favorite things that you like to say, Nick, is lean on the framework, right? Use what it gives you for free so you don't have to re-implement all this stuff from scratch. There's nothing worse than trying to imitate the way that the stock Android UI looks, because you might overlook a slight detail. You can actually just use the same styles that we used to build it, and then you're going to get the exact same and consistent behavior. I think I stole that from Rich Fulcher, so sorry, Rich.
Exactly. So one thing you'll notice is that in the next couple of screens, next couple of slides, we're going to be using this question mark Android : syntax. And that is basically a theme attribute reference. We're basically accessing something that is stored in the theme, whether it be a dimension file like the list preferred item height small, which is the standard item height for a small list item, or a style resource for like loading spinners. So for example, to create a large loading spinner or indeterminate progress progress view, you simply create a progress bar and set its style to the question mark Android progress bar style large attribute, a theme attribute. And then if you want to use drawables, for example, we have built-in drawables in all the themes. So you can use the list choice indicator single drawable as, for example, the drawable top attribute in a text view or drawable left or such. So really, you get a lot of stuff for free. I definitely advise you guys to take a look at the docs for the android.r.attr Java class, I guess. It contains a whole bunch of these that you can use in your apps. So I want to talk a little bit about that space and typography stuff. The first is space. Take a look at the screen. So I think there's kind of a fundamental problem with this screen, in that it's lacking visual hierarchy, visual structure. There's kind of just floating elements out in out in this massive space that don't really have any sort of hierarchy. So one way in which we can fix this is to introduce dividers. So these dividers are basically just that. They divide different sections of the screen. It's really kind of using the minimal amount of pixels possible to introduce hierarchy rather than using boxes and borders and things. To implement these dividers, it's fairly simple. You simply set the show dividers attribute on a linear layout to middle to draw these dividers in between the different children of the linear layout. And then you provide the drawable to draw in that space. And as you can see here, the system provides a standard drawable for that space. It's also worth noting that in addition to using dividers to introduce hierarchy, you should still be using the 16-dip margins, the standard 16-dip margins, and the standard 48-dip visual rhythm that we talk about in a design guide, and that will really help establish a structure and kind of like a rhythm to your screens. So another thing I wanted to talk about with dividers is divider padding. So if you provide the divider padding attribute here, it's 8 dips. It'll actually draw some space above and below, or to the left and to the right of the divider, and this really helps introduce further hierarchy. So in this case, imagine we didn't set the divider padding on the dividers between the text and the delete icon. It would just look like a table. It would just look like a grid of things, and it wouldn't be clear what the real hierarchy was. But as soon as we introduce the padding, you can immediately see that these are a set of list items, and then within each list item, there are 2 separate touch targets. So going along with this theme of refocusing on content rather than Chrome, we want to also do that for buttons. We don't want to keep drawing borders and boxes around buttons, because we can do that in a different way. So this borderless button style, which is very commonly used with dividers, it really helps kind of simplify your UI. It really helps focus on the content over the Chrome. So one thing to note is that it is borderless, so you do need dividers to set its kind of boundaries. But when you touch the button, it does light up to indicate that this is the touch region. This is the thing you're acting on. So to use them, you simply create an image button or a button, and you set its style to the borderless button style theme attribute. This gives it to you all for free. Another variation on borderless buttons is a button bar. So if at the bottom of a dialog or bottom of a screen you have 2 actions, you can use this button bar style on your linear layout, and it will automatically create the dividers and apply the weights correctly. Actually, it doesn't apply the weights. Never mind. So it automatically adds these dividers, and when using button bars, make sure that you do the order of the buttons correctly. The preferred button should always be on the right, so save versus discard or delete versus cancel. Even if it's a negative action like delete, the preferred item should really be on the right. That's very important as of Android 4.0 and above. So you use that button bar style, and then each of the buttons in that, I've been saying the word button way too much.
It's lost all meaning.
Yes, each of those buttons needs the button bar button style applied to it so that it can actually, yeah. Somebody needs to count how many times I just said the word button, like 20. Anyway, so it's fairly straightforward. Again, this is very little code. You're not really doing much. You're just setting styles.
Lean on the framework.
Lean on the framework, yes. Take away. And again, it has that touch highlight. So another thing to think about is how do you provide this touch feedback on things that aren't buttons, things that may have kind of layout or a view hierarchy within them. Rado touched on this in his pro tip session earlier this morning. I'm not going to cover it in detail, but really using selectable item background, which is a drawable, it resolves to a drawable. Using that as the foreground or background on a view is really kind of a great way to do that. Also, if you're using a list, you can use the list selector attribute to provide the right drawable to use there.
I can't stress how important this touch feedback really is. Like, as you kind of pare back the crutches and the Chrome, you need to communicate to the user what is interactive and what does something. So anything that's interactive really needs to react visually whenever you touch it. So using things like this can really communicate that. It also will communicate the bounds which you can interact with. So as you use these borderless buttons, without using lots of kind of like bounding boxes, touching it will highlight the entire interactive bounds, so that next time the user comes back to that element, they kind of have this already this model of where they can interact with it and where they can't.
Exactly. All right, so another important visual element in the Holo visual language is list headings. So list headings are basically the things that separate different groups of list items. And they should really be 14 SP, bold, all caps, just like action bar tabs, for example. And they should have a 2-dip separator below them. So you don't really have to figure all this stuff out. You can actually just use the list separator TextView style, set that on a TextView, and you automatically get the styling. If you do end up customizing this with your brand's accent colors, then by all means use those values. This is kind of a great tool to use for kind of releasing the space to the list, the content itself in the list. So we've been talking about space a lot. I want to take a brief moment to talk about typography, which is incredibly important in the Holo visual language. So as of Android 4.0, we've given you this really robust typographic palette, I guess, for use in your apps. And so you can use new weights and variants of Roboto to really help communicate structure, rather than using text item size or text sizes to communicate structure and hierarchy. Using weights is kind of a nice way to do that. So a couple of quick notes. Don't use thin for really small text. It's best for large headings. Also, light is best for headings as well. And condensed can work really well for like news article headings. Mm-hmm. Light does work actually in body text, but you do need to be aware of the kind of the minimum sizes that you should be using.
Yeah, as a rule, you probably want to be sticking to regular or light on slightly larger type sizes, and reserve thin and maybe larger light for kind of things you want to stand out, essentially. By having larger size but a lighter type looks really, really good.
Yeah. So quick note, this is Android 4.1 and above. If you want to use this on earlier versions of the platform, you can download these fonts at Google Fonts, and you can import them into your project. One last quick note, another important part of the Holo visual language is, again, that full bleed images, using as much space as you can dedicated to content. One of the things you run into sometimes is not all photos come in the same aspect ratio. So what you can do is you can use an image view. You can use an image view with a consistent aspect ratio and drop in an image, set the scale type on the image view to center crop, to actually make sure that the image fits nicely in the image view and doesn't kind of mess with your layout. So one thing to note here is that this does end up cropping things in some cases. That's really good for, it's fine for things like bacon photos or meat or like landscapes. Not so good for like photos of people where their eyes may be cut off. It's kind of creepy. Okay. So definitely the center crop technique is very good for making sure that your UIs stay nicely aligned and fit. When using these full bleed images, it's best to kind of introduce separators between them, very light separators, maybe 1 dip or so, to really make sure that colors of different images don't bleed into each other. So that was a lot of stuff to cover, and obviously there's a lot more. We can't cover everything, but the last thing I want to cover is Holo assets. So as we showed, you can use XML and just some minor styling stuff to really provide a lot of the assets for your apps. However, you do end up still needing things like icons and PNG files and so on, and there are 3 really good tools for that. The first is the Android Asset Studio, which will generate icons for action bars and notification icons. It'll apply the right sizing, coloring, and opacity, and so on. The second is the action bar style generator that will, assuming you're theming your app with your brand's accent colors, which you should be doing, you simply drop in those accent colors into this tool, and it'll generate automatically all the different assets that you need for the action bar, tab indicators, as well as the selectable item background stuff. It'll automatically create those kind of like accented, pressed, and focused states.
In the right hierarchy, so you just drop it into your project. It's super simple.
Right. And lastly, there's the Android Holo Colors tool, which does the same exact thing for form controls like checkboxes and buttons and things like that. Now, I really want to mention that Jeff and Jerome that wrote these two tools are in the developer sandbox. So if you have bugs to report, go harass them. They're really awesome guys. And if you have any if you want a demo, a live demo of what this looks like, definitely check them out.
They're no bugs. They're great tools. Just use them. They're awesome.
There are no bugs, remarkably. So I think that's it for our talk. Thank you once again for coming. I just want to do a quick shout out that we can't take questions right now, but Nick and I both will be in the Android platform office hours where we'll be able to take questions. I also want to mention that we have an Android Design in Action live design lab. Tomorrow at 2 p.m. So if you want to come and learn how to design an app from scratch without using computer tools, we're just going to be sketching and wireframing. Definitely go check it out at 2 p.m. tomorrow.
And for those of you who are remote watching on the live stream and so forth, then we're actually quite active on Google+. So follow us on Google+, or join the Plus Android designers community. Plus Android developers, it's good.
Yeah.
And kind of join in the conversation on the #ADIA and #Android design tags. And tune in to Android Design in Action every week. So thanks very much.
Thank you.